Hello everyone. This is the lecture for Module 4 for our Population Geography course. We're going to be discussing fertility, which is a really interesting subject. Fertility is the number of children per woman of childbearing age, which is typically slated as between 15 and 55 years of age, but those numbers can vary depending on the study and the organization that's doing it. Global population growth is right now being driven primarily by the less developed countries of the world, as you can see by this chart. But there's been big changes in the world in terms of fertility. These changes are having a profound impact on society, global society, in different places in different ways. As we talked about last module, developed countries have fewer young people, but a much higher share of the elderly. They have different issues that they're challenged with. What we're going to be talking about in this section is what's happening with fertility specifically. And this has implications for both developed and developing countries. Developing countries have more young people and a smaller share of elderly. As fertility declines, there's what's called a demographic dividend or payoff. There's an economic advantage to lowering fertility. What comes along with it is increasing life expectancy. The child dependency ratio, as we talked about last time, decreases with declining fertility, freeing up a lot of resources for society. The decrease in fertility is very much linked to women's empowerment and women's workforce participation. This allows for new talent in the workforce. Some notable examples are the East Asia countries, are referred to as the Asian tigers. Starting from the 1970s, it really radically changed their cultures and societies based on declining fertility rates and women empowerment. The same thing happened in Latin America in the early 2000s. So as family size decreases, lifespan increases. That in turn changes the labor supply. It allows families and individuals to save more money. What we're talking about is an improvement in human capital, which in turn is related to very much to economic development. Let's talk about some of these numbers here. The crude birth rate, which is a different measurement but associated with and very similar to fertility rate, is a number of births per 1,000 people overall in a society. And you can see that over time, the last century or so, birth rates have been going down across the world. As you can see here in this map of the United States, the only place that's even close to a replacement fertility rate is South Dakota, which stands at 2.06. If you look at the change over time, what you see, this line in red represents the 1950 to 55 baseline, and a lot of the large countries of the world, China and India, was still around 6 children per woman. You go all down to 1975 to 1980, you can see China's already dropped quite a bit, India not as much, and other countries were still fairly high in the developing world, where you had the lowest rates, again, in the developed world. By 2005, 2010, India is below 3. China is well below replacement. Many other countries are following suit, including the United States here. This change from having many children, let's say 6 per woman, to fewer than 3, took 95 years in the United Kingdom, the first place that went through the Industrial Revolution. Also, if you look at other developed countries, it took many, many decades to lower the fertility rate by half. Today, what we're seeing is that some countries are lowering their fertility rate extremely rapidly. Like, for example, here, China and Iran, which have halved their fertility rate in about a decade. In 1947, you saw that the fertility rate per woman was very high in much of the south or the tropical regions of the world, and lower in the more temperate regions that were typically more developed at the time. By the time you get to 2022, most of the world now has much lower fertility rate, with the exception of Africa, which has lowered its fertility, but not nearly as much as the rest of the world. You can see the difference here. Another way of looking at it is looking at women's educational attainment. What is the correlation between that and the number of children per woman, or the fertility rate? In 1950 to 2020, what we see is there's been a very profound decline in fertility, if you look at the average years of schooling for 15 to 64-year-old women in that age bracket, you see also a significant decline, and these two declines correlate with each other quite well. Let's take, for example, the number of children by level of education of the mother in countries where women have on average 5 or more children shows that even within each country, the women who have much higher education have much less children. For Niger, for example, which stands really high here, women who have a higher education, college level, have about 3.5 children in their lifetime, whereas women that have no education is still hovering around 8 children. You can see that's quite significantly different. Education is really very powerfully tied to lowering fertility rates. The data is pretty clear on that. Also, labor force participation for women, has it changed from 1960 to 2021? So each of these quadrants here, around these axes here, this quadrant right here shows that the one quadrant where you're seeing most countries clustering is the quadrant where the labor participation has increased and the fertility has decreased. Again, this is another way of visualizing the data, showing that in places where women have entered the workforce, participation, fertility has declined across the world. Child mortality, again, there's a pretty good association there. What we're seeing is that the places that have the highest child mortality, hovering around 10% here, are the places that have the most children per woman, the highest fertility. And places that have the lowest mortality have the lowest. If women have access to contraception, then also we see an association where the more access to contraception that a woman has, the lower the birth rate is. You can see the Chad's way up here on the top, over 6 births per woman, very low contraceptive ability to get contraceptions, as opposed to, let's say, Argentina, which is about 2 children per woman, and a very, very prevalent contraception accessibility here. Now, Human Development Index is something we talked about in the beginning of the class. This is an index that it uses economic status or income, educational attainment, and life expectancy, and puts it into one index. And if you take all 3 together, what you see is the association is quite clear that as you go up to scale, as your Human Development Index increases, your fertility decreases significantly. Well, you also notice here that once you get below 2 or so, it begins to kind of taper off, that the rates don't drop as fast, and in some cases they actually begin to rise a little bit. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Specifically, here's income level, and what we see here, again, the same pattern. As your income increases, this is adjusted income, so it's comparable from country to country. You see there's a very marked decline in fertility, and then it begins to level off over time. So once you reach about $15,000 to $20,000 per year adjusted, and you go up, it really doesn't change all that much. There are many cultural aspects to this as well that we can talk about. For example, marriage rates are really traditionally looked at as one of the indicators of fertility, but that has changed significantly culturally over time. A lot less people are getting married. A lot more births are happening outside of marriage, and this chart shows that prevalency here in a number of countries. You're seeing the same pattern with a one notable exception of being Japan here. The other thing people ask a lot is about the one-child policy. What can government do? How powerful is government in determining the fertility rate? So what we see here is Taiwan in blue and China in red. Taiwan, what is a breakaway province of China, culturally very similar. It showed a very similar decline in fertility than China did. Taiwan never had the one-child policy. China did. You're not seeing much of a difference here in terms of effects. The one-child policy probably didn't do a lot to actually change fertility rates. There are other factors that we talked about earlier, women participating in the labor force, declining infant mortality rates, changes like going from the countryside to the city, which had a lot more powerful impact on this. That is not to say that governments don't have an influence, because they do. There are some cases where governments have made a big difference. One of the most cases of that is Greenland, which has a tiny population. The government really started to aggressively try to lower the fertility rate in the 1960s, and you can see the effect it had. A very, very powerful effect. This I think, has to do a lot more with the particularities of this country. Make an interesting paper. Religion has an effect as well. The other factors, the economic factors that we talked about earlier, the health factors are very, very powerful, but cultural factors have a role as well. And you can see that overall in Israel, there was a decline in fertility based on these major factors that affected all people of all religious stripes. But at the same time, you can see that among Jews here in this light blue line, starting around 2000, the fertility began to increase again. And that's associated with a change in a rise in religious fundamentalism and that part of the society began to increase. What's been happening in the world, as the example with the Soviet Union went through a major crisis when it collapsed. The next 10 years after were serious depression happened. Russia was really in a bad state. People had many less children, and there was a fast drop in fertility. And also with the associated countries in the Soviet Union as well, not just Russia. The Eastern Bloc countries in Eastern Europe experienced a similar thing. Starting about 10 to 15 years later, the fertility rates began to increase again as these countries began to pick up from their crisis and get back on their feet and actively try to increase their fertility through government programs. In fact, if you look at the average annual change in total fertility rate since 2007, what you do see that Eastern Europe actually had a reverse trend where all these Soviet countries, Soviet-controlled nations, actually began to increase their fertility rate after leaving the crisis that happened because of the fall of the Soviet Union. In Western Europe, it's kind of a mixed pictures. Some countries really began to aggressively try to promote fertility or pronatal policies, and that had an effect of stabilizing the drop. Whereas in East Asia, in most cases with a few exceptions, you started to see fertility continue to decline dramatically. Japan's a little bit high here because it went through it first before 2007. So it began to try to promote fertility a little bit earlier, so it had more of a similar case than Europe is. Whereas the rest of the world, you're seeing pretty dramatic decline, most notably in the Middle East here. Another possible reason that some people point to is environmental. It's possible that there's a lot of pollutants, a lot of factors in the environment that are actually biologically causing changes in the human population. And one of the cases of that is you can see in Western countries, men have had a significant drop in sperm concentration counts in the last decades. This is probably associated with things like plastics, mimicking hormones and other environmental factors like that, which in turn probably help reduce the fertility rate as well. There's a difference between fertility and fecundity, as fecundity refers to the frequency or the willingness and the healthiness to reproduce. So perhaps what we're looking at here is that we're also seeing a drop of fecundity versus just a drop of fertility. That is, that people are unable to bear children. It's not just a matter of choice. This is something that's really controversial, and it's being looked at today. Again, this would make an interesting paper. So the physiological capability to bear children is what we're talking about here. And it's age specific. So women tend to peak around the age of 18 to 25 and then decline again. And if you can think about it, the other aspect here is as women are aging, so the average age of women has gotten older and older and older. So it's moved from around the late teens, early 20s, now to near 35, 40, the number of pregnancies per woman are going to decline biologically as well because they're just not able to have as many children. There's been this decline in fecundity in modern Western society for the last number of decades. Some of the things you can do to increase fecundity: health practices, cultural practices. For example, societies that have long periods of breastfeeding their babies have less children because as you're breastfeeding, your fecundity rate is lower. You're not as likely to get pregnant while you're breastfeeding. Countries that do sterilization practices lower their population fecundity rates. So there's many other aspects we can look at here. Might make an interesting subject to talk about in the class for your research project. We have this large demographic divide in the world today still, which is shrinking, but it's still there. What we have is, you compare a country like Ethiopia to Germany. Germany has a very mature population in terms of its level of development in comparison to Ethiopia. So they may have an equal number of people, but Germany has many less children, more elderly, and for that reason, their fertility rate is going to be just lower anyway. There's just less women of childbearing age in that society. There's a lot of factors at play here, in other words. The general fertility rate, mathematically, is the births in a period from 0 to T, time, whatever that may be. Usually it's a year. Person's years lived in during that time by women ages 15 to 50 or so. It's usually multiplied by 1,000 and expressed per 1,000 in the population rather than a percentage. But again, with 8 different age groups, fertility rate will change, and you can actually measure that mathematically by using the age-specific fertility rate equation, and that's the birth in the period of 0 to T to women ages X to X plus N, divided by person's years lived during that same period of time by women. So the N is just determined by the researcher. If you look at this table, in this case, it's 5, and so it divides the age-specific fertility rates in these categories or these cohorts. So you can see it's very different depending on the age. And to get the total, you just sum up all of the age-specific ones. And this would be the equation for that. The fertility variables can be assigned for research purposes. So if you want to look deeper into this phenomena, you can begin to just assess the population based on these categories. Then you can make more accurate comparisons from one population of one, let's say, region or country to another. The reason why you might want to do this is because then you can better distinguish between fecundity and fertility rates. That has implications for all kinds of medical reasons and health reasons, and then population practices, government policies, and all kinds of things. Again, just as a review, the status of women, level of education, employment opportunity for women are really huge in determining fertility, but there are other factors as well. The type of residence that you live in, the religion of the parents, the available health care, cultural factors like machismo, economic factors like the cost of children, just how costly are children in any given country, what the government is doing, if there are any cultural gender preferences, like for example in China, where you had a disproportionate number of baby boys born when a lot of baby girls were eliminated through abortion practice, the infant mortality rate, and then there are always crises, war, instability, natural disasters that will also affect fertility as well, usually in the short term. So what we're looking at ultimately is these shifts, and these shifts are really what is going to determine what the world is going to look like in the future. So if you're going to make projections for the future, this is what you really want to focus on. And if you want to dig even deeper, you can look at unique communities, especially religious ones, that have very high fertility rates still because of cultural practices, which in their case tend to overwhelm or supersede all of the other things. And that happens usually on a case-by-case and a small scale level. Hutterites are a good example here. Now again, this all plays into the demographic transition model that we discussed in the previous module. What we can say about that is some of the reasons why the demographic transitional model sometimes doesn't work very well for a particular nation is because of these distinctive things that can happen in fertility rates. The way that fertility shifts can vary dramatically from place to place, from time to time. When we look at the actual theories behind all this data, what we can see is that the big picture is that it's all related to the advent of modernity, moving into the modern world in terms of economics and technology, industrialization, really probably is the number one factor in all of this. then it's also that factor, of course, is related to all the other ones that we've talked about. There's that school of thought that's still around, although it's not as dominant as it once was, that a lot of this happens because people just rationally decide to have less children or more children. They do a cost-benefit analysis and they make those choices. However, some people would critique that and say much of what happens is these forces happen organically without people's conscious efforts, and then become embedded into new norms that people decide is right. So, for example, you're a young woman today, and you're going to base number of children you want to have not just on these mathematical calculations, but basically in what you see around you, what other women are doing, what's considered normal today. The other factor that we haven't talked about much is how innovations in family practices or in health and so forth will diffuse over time. So these ideas, these norms that shape themselves over time can diffuse at different rates. What happens is if you're poor, you're typically not going to have the same access of communication, education, and so forth. So these ideas are going to diffuse slowly in poor populations, whereas for rich elites, which are connected at the highest level of societies, these innovations happen much faster. And so the cultural practices change quicker as well. And overall, fertility will decline much faster among people who are more wealthy and elite. And then ultimately, we can look at conscious efforts to emancipate women, like the feminist movement, the women's rights movement, the efforts to educate young girls around the world, which also have a conscious impact on all this. So we're not completely helpless to the tides of modernity or the tides of religious revitalization or whatever it might be, that there are things we can do consciously as individuals and as communities to actually have some empowerment over things like fertility. And one great example of that is efforts to empower women around the world. India has done a lot with that recently, and that again would make an interesting project for someone. What we've discovered over time in terms of development is that by focusing on educating young girls in particular, making sure they go to school, at least at the same levels as boys, that has a positive effect on the whole country. It changes fertility rates, which in turn free up resources, improve a country's economy, and everyone benefits. And you can see here by this chart, so what that looks like. One of the ways that this happens is through family planning programs. There's sometimes a tension between these programs and religion, especially when religion comes back in a fundamentalist form, which it has in many places in the world, including in the United States, as we've seen here how it has changed our laws. Now, a lot of places in the United States have less access to contraception, far less access to abortion, and so on, because religious ideology has inserted itself into the political sphere. Another big factor in this is maternal mortality, women dying in childbirth in particular. The world has made great progress in lowering maternal mortality in the world. This progress is now being threatened by things like making abortions illegal, by not providing sex education to teenagers. Another case of this, which is a little bit different, is genital cutting or genital mutilation of girls, and that's practiced in many countries in Africa and a few other places in the world, that puts girls at risk for deaths and also what we would consider horrific consequences to this practice. This practice has been made illegal in most places in the world, but it's still practiced illegally in many places, and a lot of agencies are working on trying to eradicate it with a fair amount of success, but there's still a long way to go. Just a quick history here. If you look at the past in England and Wales, where the Industrial Revolution happened first, what we see here is maternal mortality really began to decline in the 1930s and 40s. That it really didn't drop that much before then, even though other indices were dropping because of modern practices in terms of healthcare and ethics and so forth. The rates really began to drop right around the end of World War II. The rest of these slides I'm going to just go over quickly and sort of refer to them as maybe possible topics for your research project for this class. And there are these differences in the world, and we want to understand them. We want to know why there's such a difference between Africa and the rest of the world in terms of fertility, and how different regions adapted over time. We want to look at an advanced economic society that's developed. Canada would be an interesting case study. It's gone through its fertility declines, and you can see how it's linked to some historical events. Might be a good way to just take a look at a country and look at its history and how it's related to these demographic factors. You could look at generally the challenges and the problems with different fertility rates, whether they be high or low, as a research topic. You could focus on children and study children and take a look at, for example, malnutrition with children. That's related to different demographic factors like fertility. You could look at the elderly population and see how that changes society. Societies that are much older tend to be more conservative, and conservative tend to resist change. Younger people tend to be much more progressive. Older people tend to be more conservative. With that conservative ideology sometimes comes these prejudices from the past. In our society, we are seeing a shift to the right, and in part that's associated with the fact that the population is getting older, and older people tend to vote at much higher percentages than young people. One other possible research topic could be to look at different ethnic populations and how their fertility rates are different. Ask why that is. Why are Hispanics higher than the rest? What's causing that dynamic? One thing of note is that the places where the fertility is declining the most, percentage-wise, are the places where it was highest. So the same dynamics are happening there as well. And eventually it's going to cause a leveling off or a balancing of this effect. Interesting paper might be looking at teen fertility rates and what's been happening there. Europe has a great many things to talk about in terms of demographics, aging populations, declining populations, and then Europe in particular, the governments there are very involved in demographics. They make a lot of effort to manage their societies, so you could take a look at that, how successful that may be, what the ethical implications are. For example, the difference between Italy and France, you could do a comparison of different countries. Why is Italy's fertility rate so much lower than France today, even though they're comparably developed? What are the cultural differences? What are the political differences that are contributing to this? So that's a way of focusing in on sort of more social dynamics when you're comparing countries that are similar in other ways that are related to sort of like when they entered the modernity, their level of economic success, their level of urbanization, all these other factors we tend to look at first with fertility. If you look at countries that are the same in those other factors, then you can sort of narrow in on the cultural stuff. Another thing you can look at is what happened in the early 80s. Why did Europe fertility begin to rise again? A lot of this is related again to the fact that governments have taken a much stronger hand in trying to promote women to have more children because they were concerned about the dropping fertility rates. Russia is a great case study because of its crisis that it went through in the 1990s. You can see here. Why was it so bad? Why did it turn around again? Interesting. Japan's always fascinating to study. The Japanese lost World War II. The United States forced them to create a new constitution. In that constitution, women got legal equality. And look at that. I mean, it really is correlated with a huge decline in fertility here. What's this fire horse drop that happened here? That's a cultural dynamic. It'd be interesting to look at that. Any situation is quite interesting in many ways. China is another case where people always like to look at the one-child policy and they always give a lot of credence to it. But in fact, how influential was it really? How much impact did it really have? It's controversial, probably not as much as people think. The Cultural Revolution probably had a lot more of an impact on the drop in fertility rates than the one-child policy did. Something to look at. India is another great case study. It's had a gradual decrease in fertility, but if you look at India more closely, you can see that the different provinces of India have had very different experiences, because in India, unlike China, where China is a central government that controls the whole country, in India, a lot of the rules, a lot of governmental policies are done by province. And Kerala is a great case study because Kerala really stands out as having a lot more success with lowering fertility and a lot of other things like better health indices and better outcomes than the rest of India. And Kerala is very different politically than the rest of India is. Africa is always fascinating. There's lots of things to look at there. If you're interested in the paper, you can look at things like religion, contraception, economic development, combination of these things to figure out why it's so much higher in fertility than the rest of the world. I hope that was interesting and helpful to you, and I would love to hear your feedback, any comments, any critiques that you might have about these lectures. Let me know. Send me an email, or if you want to meet online, we can have a video conference. Take care. See you next time.